Hello, coders. Welcome to another How to Code Well podcast. It's episode 213. It is the 13th of January. We are motoring through January. And obviously, this is a live stream. You may hear dog noises in the background. We've got two English Springer Spaniels. And general shenanigans like that. If that happens, I'll obviously pause the stream and this will be edited for the audio version of the podcast. Some news. I have finally landed a contract role, which is fantastic, and it's a great start to the year. So my dry spell has ended finally, and I was kind of feeling a bit of an imposter talking about web development and the industry of software development and PHP without actually being a PHP dev. So obviously I'm not going to talk about the role or what we do or whatever, as standard. But what I will say is how it may affect the How to Code Well going forward. It's all about managing time management. There's a fantastic book that I'm almost finishing. I've got probably 20 pages, 30 pages left. And that is Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's fantastic. It's a great book. And it's all about creating habits, obviously, and how best to chain habits and have sort of habit tracking and bad habits and how to reduce those. And How to Code Well is essentially a series of habits that I do, because there's obviously the podcast that happens on the Monday now. This needs to be edited, and obviously it needs to be scripted. Today we're going to be talking about software architecture. We'll get into that later on in the show. So I have got a script. This is what we're doing now in this year. We are actually talking from a script. At the moment I'm not, I'm just riffing, but there is a script at some point in the show that I'm gonna follow, and there's resources and links to various things that I want to talk about in the PHP world. So there's a lot of pre-content that needs to happen before I actually do any of this recording, and then there's editing and all of this stuff. Plus there's going to be tutorials that go out. There's going to be a tutorial that goes out every Thursday. So how on earth do I do all of this and fit all of this in? Well, the current before having work, I was able to do this during the day, right? So I was able to smash out a bunch of tutorials and schedule them up. So I've managed to schedule up tutorials for every Thursday all the way up into May. So that's one thing I'll tick off of my list to do. But when it comes to the podcast, and it's something that I really want to keep doing because I know how popular that is, especially the audio format on Spotify, is the way in which I am planning has changed. So now what I do and I've been doing this for the past 2 weeks, is I get up at 5:30 Monday and Tuesday mornings, and I'm in the office nice and early, and that is my best time to write. So there's a lot of writing going on with How to Code Well. And so for a good probably half an hour, 45 minutes, I can write a script for the show. So today we're talking about software architecture and how to choose the right one. And what I do is throughout the week, I think of a topic and I research that topic. I've been listening to web pages, which is fantastic. If anybody hasn't done this yet, please do. It's amazing. Pretty much you can learn whilst you do other things by listening to web pages. So I've been listening to all sorts of blogs. It's essentially like having your own podcast, and I do this whilst I clean the car or I do some housework or whatever, or just take the dogs for a walk, and I'm constantly learning, right? It's brilliant. So I've been learning a lot about software architecture, which is part of the show. And so throughout the week, I have a topic that I want to learn and investigate. And then what happens is on the Monday morning, I'll get up super early and I will come up with sort of a script, put all my thoughts together. And then what happens is on the Monday evening, so at 5:30, we do the podcast. And then on the Tuesday morning, I get up again at 5:30 and I will edit the podcast and then push it out to Spotify and the various other players. And that doesn't really take that much time, to be honest. And I've got myself into a situation where, or a habit where the podcast, I'm trying not to edit so much, because I used to edit everything, like to the point where there was no breathing in the audio. And that made me sound very robotic and probably less genuine. So I try, the editing of this is very small, is very, very small. It's essentially just getting the audio levels right. And I cut off the start as well. But yeah, so I've been able to reduce the amount I actually do to How to Code Well in order to keep How to Code Well going. And then on the Tuesday evenings, I will record the tutorials. And if I can get through the week with 2 tutorials recorded, that means that we have an extra week of tutorials recorded. So for example, if I was to go on holiday, or if I was to go, if I was ill, then I have a buffer. And at the moment, I have a fantastic buffer. It goes all the way up to May, so which is awesome. So at the moment, if I go to the website, howtocodewell.net, which is on the old browser here, we have the January sale going on, which is the, I think there's about 8 courses here. There's 1, 2, 3, that's 6, that's 7. No, 7 courses. There's 7 courses. So Login from Scratch by PHP is the latest one. If I click into there, you'll see that there are 11 tutorials. 3 of which are free, and then the rest of them you obviously have to pay for. And the January sale, everything at the minute is $5. This course teaches you how to log in using PHP from scratch without any frameworks at all. So there's a test-driven approach to this project, teaching you how to actually test your code as you write your code. We go into PHP Stan, we go into PHP Unit and other things like that. It's fantastic. And then, of course, we've got the other courses too. We've got Docker for beginners. We've got Linux Bash for beginners and HTML and other PHP tutorials, courses. Excuse me. So they're all available for $5 each. And then on the tutorials, the latest tutorial, which is the first tutorial for January 2025, is what is middleware. If I click into here, so this is an actual YouTube video, and then underneath there is the write-up for it. And so that's what I've been doing in terms of, when I say I've been doing a lot of writing, this is essentially it. I'm basically creating tutorials and courses, and this is what I do in the mornings. So yeah, I mean, that's really cool. And then on the Wednesday evenings, obviously I've got karate, which is great. And then before you know it, it's the end of the week. So that's pretty cool. I'm really enjoying doing this, writing courses and writing tutorials. It's nice to be able to think about code in a way that perhaps a learner is thinking about code, if that makes sense. So you're thinking about, this one here is what is Laravel middleware. So I discuss about what is the purpose of middleware, how to create middleware, how to register the middleware, running middleware on every HTTP request, assigning middleware to specific routes, excluding middleware from routes, and then resources. So I'm trying to break up the tutorials and ask myself, what is it that a learner would want to know? So what is the purpose? What's the point in having Laravel middleware? So I broke it down into these 4 things. And then like, well, how do you create the Laravel middleware? How do you register middleware? And then in the future tutorials, it'll be how do we build sort of a little mini project using middleware, and you'll slowly get used to using middleware in your Laravel. And then I think in about maybe 2 months' time, we start working back on some Symfony stuff. And then after that, we'll start going back to Laravel, which is pretty awesome. The next thing I want to talk about today is PHP 8.5. This is new. PHP 8.5. At the moment, I'm currently running PHP 8.4. And I'm so pleased to get off of 7. This one is coming down the pipe pretty soon. I say pretty soon. It's the end of the year, so it's sort of November time, the 20th of November 2025. But I imagine I'm going to keep my eye on this page, because I imagine there's going to be a lot of other features being added. At the moment, we've got these two, which is the curl multi-get handles and PHP build date constant that's been added. And there's a deprecations, which are the _* constants have been deprecated. So not a huge amount of change here, but believe me, there'll be more coming through the pipe. So what I'll do is I'll keep an eye on this page. This is php.watch versions 8.5. And if anything gets added to this, then I'll certainly report it on the podcast here. Because obviously, as a PHP developer, I want to be aware of what changes are coming through. And I think it's very important as a PHP dev to know what's on the horizon. Even if you're not yet on 8.4, even if you're still on 7, it's very important to keep yourself up to date. Especially like these things to do with curl. If you do anything to do with curl, then keep your eye on this page. I'll leave a link in the show notes to the php.watch page here. The next thing I want to talk about before we get into the software architecture stuff is the Symfony 2024 year in review. I'm a PHP dev. I do a lot of Symfony work. I do a lot of Laravel work. Again, it's very important to keep yourself knowledgeable as to what has changed and what has progressed in the frameworks that you use. So I'm just gonna I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just go through it. So this is the Symfony 2024 year in review. It was published on January the 7th this year. And it's a blog post that highlights the accomplishments of the Symfony project in 2024. There's loads that they've done, right? Loads and loads that they've done. So that we've released 2 new major versions, Symfony 7.1 in May and Symfony 7.2 in November. They also published 58 maintenance versions across 6 branches, which is 5.4, 6.3, 6.4, 7.0, 7.1, and 7.2. In addition, they published 296 blog posts, including 48 new Symfony articles explaining the new features introduced in 7.1 and 7.2. And I have been looking at some of these new features, and they are really, really quite cool. And perhaps I'm going to be doing some tutorials on these things in the coming months, perhaps. We also published, they say, 52 a week in Symfony blog posts, reaching nearly 950 weekly posts since we started, making it one of the longest running series in the entire tech industry. That's an interesting claim there. Okay, so then there's got lots of events and conferences. So they had a lot of Symfony Online things. So Symfony Online was in January, June. There's also Symfony Live in Paris and Vienna. Sadly, I couldn't make any of those in 2024, but this is what I really like about this page is they list the upcoming events. So there's Symfony Online in January. There's Symfony Day in Chicago. There's Symfony Live in Paris. There's Symphony Live in Berlin. There's Symphony Online in June. Symphony Con in Amsterdam. So that's pretty cool. And then you got the dates there. So the first one, Symphony Online, is January the 16th to the 17th. But wouldn't it be amazing to travel to one of these conferences that are, maybe in Berlin or Amsterdam or Chicago? That would be pretty awesome, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be even better to talk at one of these? They are. You can already send your call for papers, CFPs, and buy your tickets for these conferences, and then stay tuned for additional conference announcements. So yeah. Again, I'll provide links to these pages in the show notes as well. This is an incredible amount of of stats here. Symphony Components surpassed 27 billion downloads in 2024. That is breathtaking. That is amazing. So Symphony Components surpassed 27 billion downloads in 2024, 500 million in 2026, in 2016, 1 billion in 2017, 3 billion in 2019, 6 billion in 2020, 10 billion in 2021, 15 billion in 2022, and 20 billion in 2023. In 2024, 27 billion. That is incredible. That is absolutely incredible. In 2024, we released several new components. These are all listed here. I won't go through them all. There's also lots of, they published 11 security advisories, and there is a shout out to the various maintainers of the Symphony code and Symphony docs. Again, I'll put all of these links in the show notes too. And they end with a very good overall. This was a great year for Symphony. All this was possible thanks to your continuous support. Thanks for being part of the Symphony community. Look forward to an incredible 2025 when we'll celebrate the 20th Symphony anniversary and the release of Symphony 8.0. Oh yes, I will be definitely there for that. Definitely. So yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes too. All right, so let's talk about software architecture, shall we? I think I've got to the point in my career and in my programming career where I really don't care about the programming language anymore. That sounds a bit harsh, doesn't it? But I really don't mind if it's in JavaScript or if it's in PHP or if it's in Python. That doesn't really bother me. I'm not really pigeonholed into a PHP dev or a JavaScript dev. I don't mind that. Nor do I mind the frameworks. So I'm happy to work JavaScript in React, and I'm happy to do it in Vue. Or Svelte or something like that. I'm also very happy to work on Laravel or Symfony or Yi, or if it's an ecom thing, maybe Magento or Cilius or other frameworks, even WordPress. I'm not that bothered about. I'm very flexible. The thing that concerns me the most, and the thing that I believe most developers at my age who have been developing for the length of time that I've been developing for, realize that these frameworks and these programming languages, they come and they go and they improve and they get worse. It is one of those things that you have to just expect in programming. One thing though that does really fascinate me more than the frameworks, more than the programming languages, is the architecture, is the designing of the way in which a system is built, the foundations in which it's built upon, the fact that certain architectures lean very well to certain projects, and the experience of being on projects where new architectures and new ways of thinking certainly improve the code base and also improve the business going forward. And being a contractor, it's lovely to be able to jump from project to project in a reasonably short-ish period of time. I say 3-6 months time, where you're able to take your knowledge to other projects and see how other projects are developed and implemented, and see how they tackle and use and utilize different architectures. I think that's fantastic. It's very easy as a full-time dev to be stuck in the comfortable world that you're in, and only really work on a single architecture that your company has adopted, and possibly some other architectures that you're trying to introduce. But because you've not had the full experience of actually working in an architecture at full pelt, I remember there was a few projects ago where I would be on an architecture that I hadn't even been aware of, or I loosely knew about, and so you have to learn these things relatively quickly, and that's what I really enjoy. To me, software architecture is the Lego of programming. It is the way in which these bits will fit together. And of course, you can make a Lego house in all sorts of different Lego bricks. It's still a house. Some of it will be better than others. Some houses will look better than others. It's just the way it goes. And one thing that I've really seen and witnessed and been a part of, and also have for my own stuff with How to Code Well, I have certainly made the mistake of choosing the wrong architecture. And so that's what I want to talk about today, is choosing the wrong architecture, or choosing or what makes an architecture the right architecture for your software. And I think that the going forward with these podcasts, I'm probably going to be talking a lot more around the architectural stuff, because it fascinates me far more than the programming language itself or the framework, because those things, they will continue to improve, but the architecture itself is actually agnostic to the programming language that you choose, or at least it should be. And so you can transfer the knowledge of the architecture to various different languages. And that's the thing that turns me on. It's the fact that you can learn how to do an architecture, and you can then take that and implement that in all sorts of different programming languages, in all sorts of different contexts. And that makes you a very valuable developer. It's not just, PHP and just MVC and that's it. It's PHP and you also have had experience with all sorts of different architectures and in different scenarios, and you've seen the pitfalls of some, the pinch points of others, the bottlenecks of others, and how the right architecture in the right context can actually make your project sing. And I think that's very important. So anyway, let's get into it. So choosing the wrong architecture can lead to sloppy code, forced workarounds, and ultimately expensive rewrites. Developers will be locked into writing software the wrong way and may be forced to crowbar additional components into the design, which can cause future confusion and complications. The wrong architecture will make delivery of features slower and cause unnecessary stress amongst the development team. So let's just pull that apart. It's sloppy code, and as a developer, it is tempting to point fingers and say, your code is rubbish and all of this stuff. But if you're working against an architecture that doesn't quite fit, then you end up, it's like square peg round hole. You end up writing the code in the wrong way in order for it to just work. which leads me on to the forced workarounds. You've chosen this architecture, and you may have chosen that a year ago, but now the code base has moved on, and the code does not fit the architecture anymore. And so you're having to write bits of you're having to implement parts of the architecture, but not the full architecture, and you end up doing things to feed the architecture rather than have the architecture support what it is that you're trying to do. And that is incredibly stressful, and your team ultimately crowbars the additional components into the design, which can cause future confusion and complication. And the confusion there is when a new developer comes on board and they're like, what on earth is going on? Why do we do it like this? Why have you done it like this? What's all this? And that's where, unfortunately, the finger pointing goes into play. And you really shouldn't be doing any of that, because you need to understand the background of the project, and you need to understand that, hey, these guys probably had time constraints and budget problems, and they were trying to throw things at the wall and see what's stuck. And so the whole get it out the door quickly mantra probably was what they were trying to do, rather than actually, and they probably have never had the opportunity to think about the architecture with the time in which it takes, because this is complicated. Learning an architecture is complicated. Having the buy-in of the team is a challenge sometimes. It's a culture shift. But ultimately, the wrong architecture will make delivery of the features far slower, which causes unnecessary stress amongst the development team. Because devs want to get code out the door. They don't. A good dev wants to get code out the door. A bad dev wants to just hide and not put the code out. But a good dev wants to keep delivering code, because you'll only know if your code works when you get it delivered, right? When the tests pass, and when actual users are using your code, and when the client actually wants you to do more and more of it, and they get used to the speed in which you're working at. Again, you end up, it's like a conveyor belt, and if the conveyor belt is stuck because the architecture is wrong, it may be the conveyor belt is now having to go up a hill to get over this bump, which is introduced by a bottleneck within the code architecture. Then you got problems, and everyone gets stressed out. So here are some considerations when choosing software architecture. The first one: does the architecture meet the functional needs? Consider the current requirement of the system, or requirements of the system, I should say, its boundaries and possibilities, and see if the architecture that is currently there matches what is needed. Make a note of the areas that are no longer compatible with the architecture, or areas of misuse. You have to be quite sort of you've got to be quite strict on yourself here. This is an architecture and it's supposed to be doing this, but we're doing it like that, and so that is missing. You're not using it correctly, essentially. So does the architecture meet the functional needs of the system that you're currently using? And if it does, that's great. If it doesn't, then you've got problems. And if you're trying to use the architecture in a way that the architecture shouldn't be used in, then that is another problem as well. Again, programming, you can write code in so many different ways and have it do the same thing. Just some will be more efficient, more maintainable, more usable, more reliable than others. And when you consider the future needs of the system and its possibilities, then you also need to look at the architecture and see, does the architecture that we're currently using, will that map well to the future considerations of the system? Okay, how usable is the architecture? Can the developers implement the architecture with ease, and will the system adapt quickly to its new design? So there could be a skill issue here. So if you've chosen an architecture and you're talking to the team about the architecture, then you need to ensure that the team know how to implement that architecture, know the boundaries of that architecture. How are you going to prevent your developers from falling back to the old ways of writing software? The architecture must A, make reasonable sense to those who use it, and B, be convenient to use. So it might be convenient to just use the old way of writing code and using the old architecture and writing hacks here and there. It might be convenient to get things out of the door, but this is where you have to actually become quite strict and go, no, this is the architecture that we've agreed on. We're not doing it like this, even though your quick little workaround might work for today, but that's just going to end up as technical debt. And we need to do it like this. This is where you end up having an advocate of the architecture, and they are fighting for the architecture. They are making sure that the architecture is not mistreated and misused. But of course, the advocate of the architecture needs to be aware of when the architecture no longer is usable and no longer can fit the requirements of the ongoing system. And systems are ever evolving, so you have to be aware that the architecture that you use today may not be the architecture that is in place in a couple of months' time. And you need to be okay with that. Just because you came up with the idea doesn't mean it's your little baby, all right? Okay, how reliable is the architecture? If you are thinking about adopting a different architecture, then create a list of all the current pain points of the current system. Will the new architecture reliably solve these issues, and will it provide the functionality needed to meet the requirements of the system? So, make sure that the architecture that you're choosing is reliable, and not just here's a proof of concept of how reliable the architecture is. If you are thinking about your system in terms of scale, then you need to throw a lot of things at it. You need to prove that it's okay. In fact, the other developers need to prove that it's not okay. And then settle upon a choice. Okay, how well does the architecture perform? So there's no point in adopting a software architecture only to find that it buckles under load. You may find bottlenecks in the system. It is important to test the system and know where the potential issues may live. Okay, so you might go, okay, we've decided that we want to change, MVC to ADR, for instance. Okay, well, we could have if your application isn't an API, then why are you doing that in the first place? And also, you might end up having to write a load of responders that you don't necessarily need to do, and so you're slowing the system down in that sort of sense. Especially if you start throwing in the model layer at various different points where it shouldn't be. Again, misuse. Also, you might be implementing an architecture or a methodology such as event sourcing when you don't need to. And you end up with this massive queue of things that, yes, you can rerun, but actually it's just a blog post. An MVC could have been much better. But also, in my opinion, architecture it's not just the system as such. It is also the design patterns of that system. So it might be that the design patterns of how things are actually being processed could be changed. You might find that perhaps you need to deal with the command pattern a bit more, or the factory patterns aren't great, or maybe you've got horrible singleton patterns in your code, or the adapter patterns need to be adjusted, all of those kind of things. And if the performance of those isn't great, then you will suddenly find those in your in your scale testing. Sorry, as I've been talking, I've been trying to think of a tool that I've used before. I think it's called Siege, where you basically fire a lot of requests at something and you just see how your application loads and handles under load. So that's a tool that you could use. Okay, so how can architecture be implemented and supported? This is the next one. So ideally, the architecture that gets implemented now will still be in use in the few years to come. Ideally, it's not always the case, but ideally. If this is the case, then perhaps the decision to choose the architecture was the correct one. However, it could be that nobody has had the balls to actually say this is a bad architecture. Software is an ever-moving animal and change is inevitable. Hopefully, the architecture becomes a fixed design that proves itself. I don't like the word fixed design there because it evolves. A fixed design that proves itself as other software decisions are agreed upon. So let's say, for example, you decide that you want to use ADR, and you've decided that actually you want to be doing Python instead of PHP. And so you can still use your ADR architecture, but you would write it in a different programming language. That's a very extreme example, but another example could be a framework. So you've chosen to go down with Yi. You're going to do Yi, and you're building this in ADR, but actually you want to do it in Symfony. Well, the beauty of some of these architectures means that you're actually writing code agnostic to the framework that you're using, which is amazing. I would advise people to avoid any frameworks that have any opinions about any architectures. Because if you can get a framework where you are more in control of the various things and you can break away from that framework, but still perhaps carry some of the code to the new world, then that's much better. Okay, so it is important to support the architecture through the life cycle of the software and keep checking that it is being adopted in the correct manner. It is the responsibility of the team to ensure that the architecture is being followed and can still be fully utilized within the future changes of the system. This goes back to having sort of an architect advocate, someone who knows the architecture from inside and out and is like, this is what we're doing and this is why, and ensuring that all the code that gets into the code base adopts the architecture in the right way and basically ensures that it's a smooth running machine. Okay, it's so tempting to not understand the architecture, especially when you are new. You come into a role and perhaps they're using an architecture that you're not familiar with. And so you end up writing code which is like the architecture that you're more used to, which is probably MVC, but actually it might be different. And there are so many projects out there that are MVC that probably shouldn't be MVC. So that is why I think in 2025, I'm going to be focusing my time less on learning the programming languages and the frameworks, and more on actually understanding the patterns and understanding the architecture and understanding when an architecture suits a certain project and when it doesn't. And the beauty with the architectures, in my opinion, is that you don't get the camps of people saying this architecture is better than this architecture is better than that architecture, not like you do with frameworks. And also another thing that's really cool about architecture is that when you talk about the latest architecture, you're talking about an architecture that's been around for years. Okay. Whereas with, say, JavaScript frameworks, I wonder how many frameworks there's going to be available this year, right? And so you don't have the hotness. It's actually, in that respect, it's boring compared to like getting the latest and greatest iPhone, for instance. It's an architecture that has been well defined and documented over the past few years. And I think it's really important for us devs to fully grasp and understand what our software can and cannot do using these particular architectures. So maybe in the coming weeks, we'll talk about more architectures. Maybe I'll do one around MVC first, and then I'll move to other bits and pieces later. I remember when I started work, decades ago, I had to give a presentation to the people who were interviewing me on MVC. So, and how great MVC was. And at that time, I didn't know that there was any other architectures ever. So now, obviously, I know that there's quite a few. And that MVC is perhaps not the best thing in the world for certain things, and it is the best thing in the world for other things. But having that knowledge in this period of my career is certainly going to help me going forward. Anyway, I need to shoot off. Thank you ever so much for listening to me ramble on. As I said, this is going to be on the Spotify and other audio players tomorrow. And take care. Speak to you soon. Happy coding, everyone. Bye-bye.